The day my sister put a sledgehammer through the wall of my bakery, she filmed the whole thing and posted it online before I even knew she'd been inside. I had opened Hearth and Grain on a side street in the Delmore Creative Quarter 4 years before any of this happened. I was 38 years old, had spent a decade working as a healthcare compliance auditor, and had saved $81,000 over 8 years in a way that required a particular kind of discipline, thing. The build-out was mine entirely. I rewired the display lighting with a licensed electrician I found and supervised myself. I sourced the reclaimed oak countertops from a salvage yard, 2 hours south of the city. I installed the subway tile behind the pastry case on a 3-day weekend using a borrowed wet saw and a series of online tutorials. I named the place Hearth and Grain because both words meant something real to me. Hearth meant warmth that required tending. Grain meant something structural, something that ran through the whole material. By year 2, we had a wait list for weekend wholesale accounts. By year 3, a regional food publication described us as one of the most thoughtful independent bakeries in the district. My mother visited once. She said the croissants were dry. My younger sister Adrienne never came at all. She sent a text. The text said, "Darling." One word, no punctuation. That was her review. Our family had a financial structure that functioned from the outside like generosity. My parents, Gerald and Miriam Solt, had 2 daughters. I was the older one who left on a merit scholarship and did not ask for much. Adrienne was the younger one who asked for everything and was rarely refused. The accounting over the years was considerable. My parents co-signed 2 of Adrienne's apartment leases. They covered a credit card balance exceeding $22,000 in a single settlement. When her second driving offense resulted in a suspension, they bought her a car on the grounds that she needed reliable transportation. They financed a retail concept, a specialty tea and candle shop, to the tune of $47,000. It lasted 16 months. I never asked for any of this. I also never received any of it. When I needed a co-signer for my first commercial equipment loan, my father told me he preferred not to attach his name to business debt. Fine. I found another way. What I did not know, what I had no reason to know, was that every dollar my parents had extended to Adrienne over the years had a source, and that source had terms. I did not know about the home equity line. I did not know my parents had borrowed against their property at 19 Fenwick Terrace, where they had lived for 24 years, or that the outstanding balance on that line, by the time Adrienne walked into my bakery with a sledgehammer. I did not know. But paragraph 6.3 of my commercial lease did. Let me explain how I got there. Because none of this was accidental. 14 months before the sledgehammer, Adrienne came to Hearth and Grain with a proposal. She did not call ahead. She arrived at 10:15 on a Thursday morning, looked around the space and told me she was launching an event series, wine education, private tastings, that kind of thing, and that she needed a venue 3 evenings per week. She named a figure. It was roughly half my standard private event rate. I told her it did not work for me. She looked at the oak countertops, at the pastry case, at the hand-lettered menu my baker Rosine had repainted the previous Sunday. Then she said, very quietly, that our father had a good relationship with my landlord. She said it the way she always delivered those lines, as information, neutral and ambient, not as the specific pressure it actually was. I told her to leave my bakery. She left without visible anger. She left the way someone leaves when they have simply noted your address. The video posted on a Sunday morning at 8:17. I was at the farmer's market 4 blocks from Hearth and Grain. My phone began vibrating in my jacket pocket, then did not stop. A call from Rosine. Then another. I answered. Her voice was careful, the way voices get when the news is not something you should receive while standing on a sidewalk. I looked at my phone. Adrienne had filmed herself entering through the side door. She was wearing canvas work gloves and a baseball cap. She was holding a commercial sledgehammer, the real kind, steel head, fiberglass handle. The front display window was already gone. The hand-lettered menu Rosine had repainted was on the floor in pieces. The reclaimed oak counter she hit once on camera, squarely with the hammer. Then she looked into the lens and smiled. The caption she wrote was darling. One word. Consistent. The video had been shared over 400 times before I reached the police by phone. She had used the spare key. The spare key that had lived on the hook beside my parents' back door for 3 years because I had believed. I want to be precise about this, because the belief is embarrassing in retrospect. I had believed that the purpose of family was that they held your key when you traveled and kept your eye contact and could be trusted with the ordinary logistics of your life. I stood at the farmer's market with a paper bag in one hand and my phone in the other. I did not cry. I walked to Hearth and Grain, and I looked at the counter and I did not cry then either. A detective named Sergeant Caldwell arrived within the hour, documented the space, and handed me her card. The damage assessment, she said, would determine how the charges were structured. I made one call. Her name was Miriam Osei, and she was a commercial litigator I had known through a former audit client. She was not a close friend. She was something more reliable than a close friend. She answered on the second ring and said, before I had finished explaining, "Send me the video." "Don't move anything." I told her Adrienne had used a key my parents held. There was a pause. "Your lease," Miriam said. "Send it to me now." I had negotiated my commercial lease with care. I had spent 9 days reviewing the document before signing, working through it with a contracts attorney, and I had insisted on several non-standard provisions. Paragraph 6.3 was one of them. Miriam read it in less than 4 minutes. "Who holds your spare key?" she asked. I told her. This clause establishes third-party liability for anyone who grants access, expressly or implicitly, to a party who causes damage. It's a joint and several provision. It's broad. "Did you negotiate this language yourself?" I told her my attorney had drafted it to my specifications. I had told him I wanted accountability to flow upstream. "It flows," Miriam said. "All the way to Fenwick Terrace." The damage assessment came back at $74,200. That figure covered the structural counter repair, the window replacement, the display lighting. Rosine had 2 school-age children. She was out of income for those 4 weeks. Adrienne's attorney, a man named Brett who called me on a Wednesday afternoon with the ease of someone who had not yet read paragraph 6.3. I let him finish. Then I asked him to pull up the lease and read paragraph 6.3 aloud to me. The silence on the line had a specific texture. "I'll need to review the full document," he said. "Take your time," I said. Miriam had already filed. Not only against Adrienne but against my parents, as the parties who had provided the key and therefore access and therefore met the threshold for implicit authorization under the clause. Their homeowner's policy had been notified. Their lender, a regional institution called Meridian Home Capital, had received a copy of the filed claim. What Miriam had discovered in 70 hours of research was that the home equity line on Fenwick Terrace carried a covenant of its own. Any active civil liability claim, exceeding $60,000, filed against the primary borrowers triggered a mandatory balance review. My claim was $74,200. My father called on a Friday. He was not composed. He told me I needed to withdraw the claim. I told him I was not going to do that. He said the house was not the issue. I said the bakery was not an abstraction either. He said Adrienne had made a mistake. I said she filmed it, posted it, and captioned it with the same words she had used to dismiss what I built 4 years ago. That is not a mistake. That is a position. He said several more things. I heard them all. Then I said, as calmly as I could, that I loved him but I was not going to drop it. My mother did not call me directly. She had Adrienne call. Adrienne's voice, when she finally spoke to me, was different from anything I had heard from her before. The performance was gone. She sounded, for the first time in my memory, genuinely frightened. "If they lose the house," she said, "that's your doing." I let the sentence sit between us for a moment. Then I told her that she had taken a sledgehammer to something I built with my own hands, filmed herself doing it, posted the footage, and chosen a caption. I asked her to think carefully about which one of us had constructed this situation. She started to speak again. I told her I had to go. Rosine needed her paycheck processed. I ended the call. Meridian completed their balance review in 26 days. They did not call the full line that required a final judgment, not merely a filed claim, but they required my parents to post $38,000 in additional collateral within 45 days or accept a refinance at a substantially higher rate. My parents did not have $38,000 liquid. The settlement was reached without trial. Brett, who had by then clearly read paragraph 6.3 multiple times, negotiated a final figure of $67,000 payable over 20 months with my parents as co-obligors on a personal guarantee. Sergeant Caldwell called me the following week. Criminal damage charges had been filed. The video timestamped, her face visible, her caption attached, served as the primary evidence. Adrienne received a conditional discharge and 180 hours of community service. I reopened Hearth and Grain on a Wednesday morning in early summer. Rosine repainted the menu. My friend Daria came at 7 with a bunch of dahlias, which she put in a jar on the counter without asking if that was all right. I made coffee for both of us. We stood at the reclaimed oak counter, re-laminated, more structurally sound than the original, and drank it without ceremony, because there was nothing ceremonial about this. This was just the place, open again. My parents have my phone number. I have not blocked it. But neither of us has called the other since the settlement documents were signed. We exist in the same city the way two systems can share the same weather map, present, overlapping in some abstract sense, no longer in contact. Adrienne deleted the video. The internet archived it in 11 places before she did. Hearth and Grain is open 6 days a week. Last quarter was the strongest revenue period since we opened. Rosine got a raise. The reclaimed oak counter catches the afternoon light at the angle I designed for when I was installing subway tile on my knees with a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed wet saw, building something I intended to last. She called it darling. I called it mine. There is a version of this story where I was supposed to absorb the loss quietly, preserve the peace, and accept that some people will always confuse your patience with permission. I didn't do that. I'm not sure I'd do it differently. The question I keep returning to is not whether I was right, but this: have you ever taken careful inventory of who holds a key to something you built, and whether they know what that means?